in the sense that they have got the R2s now coming out for Revit and a few of the other products. So they're releasing R2 halfway through the life cycle of the product, and there's quite a few new features in there, quite a few good features. Everybody uses those for a bit, and then of course the next version comes out, like Revit 2017, and people look at the list and go, "Poor, gee, what have they been doing all this time?" So this is I guess a bit of a problem that Autodesk has created for themselves, but it's good because it means that we're getting new features every 6 months rather than having to wait every 12 months. So there's a few key features, I think, which will be of great interest to people, BIM managers and so forth. Global parameters, that was released in R2, but it's been slightly refined in 2017. There's also the ability to put in calculations in annotation tags. There's been some improvements in scheduling. There's been some changes to the text editor. Now, I guess, depending on your point of view, you might use the word improvement, or you might use the word another word. The problem is that the text editor, because of the way it translates the text, if you're upgrading projects, it can actually change the layout of the text, so it actually spreads text out slightly. And so that's just something to be aware of. I guess, typically you try to avoid upgrading a project, I should say, midstream anyway. So just something to be aware of. We'll have a look at that later. Structural and mechanical and electrical and plumbing, I won't be spending too much time on those simply because that's not really where I come from. So I will look at some of the key features there. I won't be looking at them in great detail, unfortunately, if that's your discipline. MEP, I will be looking at the fabrication side of things. I think there has been further enhancements of the fabrication tools that are in Revit, and they definitely have been working on that behind the scenes. So really, I guess the bulk of these changes on both these columns are things that are to do with Autodesk's acquisition of the fabrication products a few years ago, plus in the structural side of things, Autodesk has acquired the advanced steel, advanced concrete products. And so what's happening is they're tying in those two products with the Revit product to allow a better workflow and to allow the model to actually more accurately represent what you're going to end up with in the actual construction. Okay, so moving right along. Depth queuing is a nice little presentation feature. Now, it is interesting. I've had a bit of a play with this. Obviously, one of the things that I initially assumed that would be happening in this tool is that Revit's going to be taking the cut plane of a section or an elevation, and it's going to be putting in different line weights depending on how close or how far something is from you. In fact, that's not really what the tool's about. It's more about making things faded over distance rather than changing the line weights, as far as I can tell. We do have the Revit XT tool that's a subscription benefit if you're with Cadgroup that actually does change the line weights. So perhaps those two tools could work in collaboration in a view. But I'll show you quickly anyway what that tool does. If you've got very large, complex projects and you have a lot of different reference planes in there for different purposes, an interesting feature is the ability to make different subcategories of reference planes. So we'll have a bit of a play with that. So that means that you can actually add organization into your project, or a higher level of organization, especially with with reference planes, where you can actually make different colors for different purposes, so people can actually understand visually. Because you've got different subcategories too, it means that you can use visibility graphics to hide or show those subcategories of reference planes and views to simplify things. It could also mean that you could use filters too if you wanted to be clever and use rule-based ways of hiding particular reference planes and views. Okay, this is a good feature. Essentially, you can take an object like a roof, a slab, or in this case a wall, and you can actually host a railing on top of it. Very, very good tool. very first thing that I thought, and I guess a lot of people out there who are watching this would be thinking is, oh, that's great. I can now make this, make my railings align to my topo surface. And no, you can't. Sorry. I did try it. Doesn't work. But I guess there's other workarounds like creating, you know, retaining walls, for example, that follow the contour of the topo surface. And also, you can't use reference planes to host the railing either, which would have been nice in the context of trying to make it conform to a topo surface, for example. Instead of having to build a 3D object to make it, to host it to, you could have actually hosted it to the reference plane. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Perhaps 2018, hey? Okay, global and calculated parameters. This is, in terms of these things called global parameters, this is really more of an evolution of what was started in 2016 R2. If you didn't ever touch 2016 R2, then this will all be new to you. But what I can do is, in the same way that I can create a parametric or a labeled dimension in the family editor, I can do the same thing now within the project environment. And I can control those parameters. I can also create formulas, for example. And I'll show you an example of a very simple example of what you can do there. I think the interesting thing is that it does allow you to create a certain degree of automation in the positioning of elements inside the project. So that's just something to think about. I'm sure there's cleverer people out there who have a very good idea of some of the things that they could do with it. Now here's a really, really interesting bar graph. No, it's not. That proves conclusively that 2017 displays elements even faster than 2016. So there you go. That's impressive. The rendering engine has had a bit of a workover. Up until now, what's happened is if you've done renders internally inside Revit, you've been using what's called the Mental Ray rendering engine. Now, that's actually owned by NVIDIA, and that would have been licensed by Autodesk. Autodesk also created their own rendering engine called the Ray Trace engine, and that's now become the default rendering engine inside Revit. I guess that in some way gets around licensing it from NVIDIA, but you can still do cloud rendering, so you still have the ability to render to the cloud. But one of the things you can't do when you're cloud rendering, or at least the last time I tried it, I might be wrong there, one of the things you couldn't do was create a walkthrough and render each frame. So this rendering engine is a lot faster than the rendering engine, the Mental Ray rendering engine. So, okay, the results aren't going to be as absolutely photorealistic as Mental Ray, but the speed increase is very noticeable. It still uses physically accurate lights and materials and reflections and so forth. So there's no change there. It is still a physically accurate rendering engine. One of the good things about it is though it operates in the same way, I guess. It's almost a recreation of the real way that light actually works inside a physical environment. So in Mental Ray, when you hit the rendering engine, you'd get sort of, especially if it was an internal render, you'd have to use certain tools to try and create extra light inside. Then you'd have to sit there and wait until it rendered each little part of the window. If you didn't let it get right the way through to the end, then basically the product, what it was producing, was quite useless. With the ray tracer, essentially it starts out fairly grainy, but then as each iteration happens, it becomes progressively more detailed. So the point is that you could actually let the thing render for 5 minutes and get an okay render, if that's all you've got, or you can let it render for 2 hours and get a really crisp render, a really detailed render. When you're doing the walkthrough, for example, and you output it into the ray tracer, you could actually tell Revit to only spend 5 minutes per frame. And if you know that there's 200 frames, then you can just do a bit of simple maths and work out how long the render is going to take. So I think it certainly has some interesting potential if you're looking at doing renders inside Revit, and I think specifically walkthroughs. Okay, so the edit in canvas, as Autodesk has called it, what that really means is that the way that we can edit text now in Revit has become a little bit more like a word processor. So I can have indents in my text, I can have sub-indents, I can have bullet points, and I'll just do a quick demo to explain how that all works. When you export this to something like AutoCAD, your level of what's the word? I'm just trying to think of a word. The way that it comes out in AutoCAD is basically they've designed it in such a way that the export retains the formatting. That's probably the best way to explain it. Okay, so anybody who's done an upgrade from 2016 or 15 up to 17 will have realized that there is a bit of a bug. Well, I wouldn't say a bug, but what's happened is the formatting of the text gets wider depending on the actual font. So Arial supposedly gets wider by 2%. There you go, there's a geeky fact for you. And some of the other fonts get wider by maybe 10, 15%, depending on the spacing. That may be subject to a service pack. I certainly know that there is another bug that's already been identified that is causing Revit to do all sorts of weird stuff in viewports. It's reversing the graphics. And that's actually being, the development team's aware of that already, and so that's going to be in the service pack as well. So if you are upgrading, as I said, probably best to try avoid upgrading a project midstream. If that's unavoidable, then one of the things that you will have to do is just have a look through different viewports and have a look at the way the text may have changed. Calculations in annotation tags, I'll actually show you an example of that. Probably not a terribly good example, but it will hopefully give you a taste for how you can actually put in calculations in tags. Scheduling improvements. One of the really cool things that I can do now is create a view template for a schedule. That's something I could not do before. Well, I could, but it wasn't really a template because all it did was just control the way the graphics looked in the schedule. It didn't control the fields that were actually in the new schedule. So this is a pretty big advance, I think. You can now put into your project template a number of different view templates for different schedules. You can also display minimum and maximum values for calculations. You can do combined fields where you can actually show combinations of different parameters in the same column, and then have spacing, have different things in between them. So that's just a bit of an enhancement in the way that you actually display the information. Now, if you've used Revit, I believe in Revit 2016 R2, and then obviously in 2017 as well, they introduced a feature in room schedules where you can have sub-schedules. So you can have a schedule of all your rooms, but then have a sub-schedule that showed all the furniture in each one of those rooms. So that is, strictly speaking, not a 2017 enhancement, but I do mention it in case you haven't used Revit 2016 R2. Tangency locks in sketches. Now, this is one of these features that I really have sort of grappled, sort of trying to find an application for. And again, I'm sure there's plenty of cleverer people out there watching this who could probably think of things that this can be used for. I'll show you an example of it anyway, and I'm hoping that somebody out there can actually come up with a reason for using it. Some of the things I won't be actually looking at in the actual demonstration is this thing called Format 360, which is a web-based sort of SketchUp style environment where you can do free-form modeling. So what they've done is they're still working on Format 360, and they're creating a workflow now where you can go from Format into and turn it into a Revit family and bring it into the project, and vice versa. So you can go from Revit and bring it out into format and then manipulate the object. So this is, I'm guessing that this feature may eventually end up integrated into Revit. I'm hoping that's the case. So that we're looking at a potential of having free-form modeling in Revit, which would be pretty awesome. Insight 360, now I don't know how widely used this feature is in Australia, but energy modeling, what they've done now is they've brought out this Insight 360, and it uses cloud points, but essentially it's I guess an intuitive way of actually reporting energy information in the model. So I believe they've done a lot of work to try and make it as seamless and integrated and efficient as possible. Okay, won't spend too much time on this part, but I will do some demos here just to show you some of the interesting developments that they've done with fabrication. So they introduced in 2016 the idea of having these fabrication parts. So obviously you've got your generic ducting and pipe and tray and so forth in Revit MEP, or just Revit as it is these days. And the level of detail was quite low. It was really just a design intent model, let's face it. And it didn't have things like proper connections as they would be actually fabricated, and the elbows weren't correct radiuses and so forth. Now, if you're using the fabrication suite of products, of CAD, MEP, CAD, MEP, CAM, Duct, and SMEP, and you're already in that workflow, then all of this will make great sense to you and will be applicable to you. For the great majority of people who aren't using that, then this probably won't really mean anything. But if you are using the fabrication product, you have a database that has all of your different services in it that define all the ducting and piping and cable tray services and lengths and all sorts of standard depths and heights and so forth. So they've done some enhancements here, and essentially what I can do now is draw some generic duct or pipe and turn it into fabrication parts. I can take the lengths of duct and pipe and I can optimize them so that they fit the maximum lengths that are allowable within that particular specification. There have been some additional fabrication tags that have been, well, I wouldn't say created, but you can now report much more detailed information on the fabrication parts. In 2016, you couldn't really report much about them at all, and they've just enhanced that a little bit, so I'll just show you a quick demonstration of that. There is this ability to take two open ends of a pipe or a duct, for example, and use the write and fill tool to actually get Revit to join the two up and then provide suggestions about layouts, provide suggestions about the different fittings that it's going to use. That's similar, I guess, to the Revit MEP tool, except of course this is using real fabrication pieces. The way that you connect things up and the way that you can edit things with fabrication parts has been improved, so you can use the trim and extend tool and so forth. There have been some improvements too with, well, one of the things you couldn't do in Revit 2016 with fabrication is actually put a piece of duct or pipe or tray in that had an angle in it, which I thought was a major shortcoming. That's been addressed, so you can actually put in slopes. If you do join up the piece of pipe or duct or whatever, you can adjust the slope afterwards. You can also swap out fittings after you've placed them together. That's another enhancement from 2016. I think a big one, though, is the hangers. So with hangers now, you can do things like have trapeze-style hangers, where you have them sort of sitting out to the side as per this diagram up here in the corner. You might have some pipes running along there adjacent to your duct, which is a very common scenario in installations. You can also have tiered, and I will attempt to demonstrate how you can actually have tiered hangers. I'm sure that will be quite comical. Okay, another one, if you are using Revit electrical, the electrical part, and you're doing calculations on electrical loads, you can now do apparent loads. Now, I never studied electrical engineering. I think apparent load is the difference between the true and the reactive load. There you go. That's what my Google searching taught me anyway, so I'm sure someone understands what that means. You can also now in inducting, you also have a new parameter called delta T, temperature difference parameter. And when you examine any part of the ducting or pipe or whatever in Revit, you can also have a look at the ASHRAE table settings and adjust those and report those in your schedules. Again, that probably means nothing to a lot of people. I certainly struggle to understand all of that myself. There have been improvements in the way that annotation displays on MEP systems, which I'm sure will be very appreciated by people who use that side of the program. Okay, structural engineering enhancements. You can now split columns vertically. When you do so, you can actually add in connectors. Revit will place in a generic connector if you don't have advanced steel installed, that is. If you do have advanced steel installed, then you have access to, in the same way as the fabrication side of things, you then have access to all of those specific real connectors inside Revit. So you can see that sort of how that workflow is all coming together. Reinforcement, though, has had a big another workover. I think it's become a lot more detailed. So you can now define rebar couplers, for example. The representation of rebar has become much more detailed. You can number the couplings and so forth. So there is a much higher level of realism. If you do a rebar and distribute it through a concrete slab, for example, you can now actually set up different distributions for the rebar throughout the one element, which I believe was not possible in previous versions of Revit. Again, there's an enhancement. I believe in 2016 there was a feature that allowed you to place rebar more accurately in section elevation views. That's had another bit of a workover. So you can actually place the rebar in a host, and you can use temporary dimensions to place things really accurately. Bent fabrication sheets. So again, this sort of represents a real-world scenario where you might have a Rio that runs through a slab that bends down, and that's now been incorporated into 2017. There's a much greater level of detail in the connectivity of structural elements, and again, this sort of ties in with the fact that the advanced steel product is sort of being more incorporated into Revit. As I mentioned before, if you do have advanced steel, then you will have access to these more detailed connector families and be able to place them into the model. There's a number of additional steel profiles that have been added in, and all of these steel profiles are in accordance with Australian standards. And you can also attach structural columns to foundations. There you go. I didn't know you couldn't do that, so that's probably not going to be all that earth-shattering again if you're not really in that side of things. Okay, moving into the demo. I'm sure you're all really excited to look at that PowerPoint. Okay, I've just set up some settings here. I'll just cancel out of that. Okay, so that's the default way that Revit's going to show me the objects in this view. If I just turn on ambient shadows, that gives a bit more depth. But if I just turn on depth queuing, I should say, and then just have a bit of a play here, you can see what what Revit's essentially doing there. It's just altering the gray scale of objects. Now, what it's not doing, as far as I can tell, is changing the line weights. Initially, I guess, misinterpreted what this tool was actually going to do. I can't really see it changing the actual line weights of objects, but it certainly does add a bit more depth to your views. So that's that feature. Okay, so the next cab off the rank is hosting of railings. Now, as they say in the cooking shows, here's one I prepared earlier, but this one I will do. So I'm just going to put in a nice little shape there. Oops, whoops. All right, so I'll just go to the site plan, and I will throw in a railing. At this point, I'm actually just going to do this in a plan view, and when I finish it, it's not going to be anywhere sort of in relation to where I want it to be. You can see it's actually sitting embedded in the wall. So I just go pick new host, and just like magic. Okay, so one of the things that's interesting, which I have found, is that if the host does change shape, then you don't have to refresh the object. It will actually change as the host changes, which I think is pretty cool. Okay, reference lines. That's your sort of BOGO standard reference line there, reference plane, I should say, that everybody would be used to. If I go to the object styles, then and go to the annotation objects, not the model objects. Reference planes, you can see I've had a bit of a play here already, but I'm just going to make a new subcategory. Just call that test, and then just give that some sort of lurid color, so it's really obvious. So I'm just going to create a new reference plane, and I can actually pick the subcategory before creating it. And beg your pardon, I can pick from these different subcategories. So as I said, you could probably, visibility graphics, this now gives you the ability to create a view template, for example, that filters out certain types of subcategories of reference planes. So it's a way of adding a little bit more organization to views. Okay, so next thing I want to look at is global parameters. So I'll just go to level 1, and I will group this group of objects. I'll get rid of these ones, don't need those anymore. Create a dimension, and I'll dimension between the grid line and the side of that. Okay, so I've got my dimension there, and you can see here that I've got this additional dialog, which allows me to pick an existing label or parameter. In this case, I'm going to create a new one. I'll call that angle A. Right, so I'm going to take another one of these, and I'll copy it, make another dimension. This time I'll just dimension off that curtain wall. So again, that's just a standard dimension at this point. I can go through here now and grab angle A. If I go to the Manage tab, I've got my global parameters here that reports them all. If I grab that one there and make that 45, you can see now I've got my little tables dancing around. that's all fine and good. But one of the things that I can do on top of that is I can, for example, come in and make a new parameter, angle B. You can also make these reporting parameters too, importantly. So in instances where you want to actually get Revit to create a parameter that doesn't drive the geometry but just gives you a figure, which you can then use elsewhere, if you were to create two parameters that might actually work on the same geometry and push against each other, Revit will give you an error. By using a reporting parameter, what you're actually doing is relaxing that and letting Revit will let you then have two labeled parameters or more on the same object. But because it knows that it's reporting, it's just being dragged around and reporting the value, then it lets you do that. So that's just a little bit of an aside if you've never really played around with that side of things in Revit. Global parameters. Let's go back. Okay, so angle B, and I'm actually going to call that angle A multiplied by 2. Let's see if Revit lets me do that. Okay, so what that is now doing is and I guess this is a thing where you might, some applications for this for some people might be immediately obvious, but this is really allowing me to control multiple elements, create relationships between elements, and drive positioning or angles of elements inside the project. So I think there are some interesting implications for that one. Okay, moving right along, view display, look at that. I'm zooming in really fast and zooming out really fast. Okay, ray tracing. This is a ray trace that was 3 minutes. Now, if I had done a 3-minute render in this same image in 2016, I would have basically had something that was pretty unusable. So the settings allow me to go in, and one of the things I can do here is if I go to the advanced, I can say I want this to be, say, 5 minutes per frame. And that's something I could do inside, as I said, you could do that inside a walkthrough, for example. So this will then devote 5 minutes to that render and then stop at the end of 5 minutes. So I think that's quite interesting. Okay, so I'll just create a bit of text, and I'll create a bullet point here. So you can see that we've got some bullet points there. I can change those as I'm going. If I click on the increase indent, then that creates another sort of indented bullet point. So I can say indent and so forth. So that's an interesting little development. One of the other things is this ability to turn things into caps or lowercase. And the other thing is superscript, which is really neat. So if that was always a pain in Revit when I wanted to display something like that. That was always a pain. I had to I always used to go into Word, then copy that out of Word and then paste it into Revit. And now, of course, you can do it inside Revit. So I think that's quite neat. Calculations and annotation tags. I just realized I'm sort of running late on time here. That's why I'm suddenly speeding up. So, okay. So a few things that we need to do, first of all. If you've never played around with shared parameters, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make a new parameter, and using shared parameters, and essentially it's numerical, it's just a number, and it's just an arbitrary thing called room efficiency that I'm creating. The next thing that I would do is I would go into project parameters, and I would add that shared parameter like so. And then what I have to do is tell Revit what I want to inject that shared parameter into. In this case, it will be rooms. So as soon as I do that, if I select a room, you're going to see that all of the rooms now have this new this new schedule appearing. I'm just going to give those an arbitrary value. Just bear with me here. So I'll give that an arbitrary value. Okay, that's the first part of it. And that's something that has existed in Revit pretty much always. You could always do shared parameters or pretty much from the start. But I think the next part of it is this. If I click on that tag and delete that one, and then come in here, and then what I've got to do manually is grab that shared parameter because Revit doesn't see it here. So I'm going to add that into this particular tag. Then I go and create a new label. Chuck that in there. Because I injected that into the tag, I can now grab that one. Did I do that correctly, or did I do something silly? Just make sure I haven't done something silly. So create a new label. Where am I looking? Oh, beg your pardon. Sorry. Mental block. Okay, here it is. So I'm actually adding it into the dialog. Beg your pardon. All right, so there it is, room efficiency. All right, so now I can do that, and that, again, that's just something that's always been in, pretty much always been in Revit. That's no big deal. But the big deal is that I can now go in here and create a calculated value. And I'll call that efficiency percentage, for example. Whoops. And then I'll say it's a numerical value. And then I can go in here and say it's going to be a function of area, let's say divided by that room efficiency value. Now I'm going to get an error if I hit OK, because Revit doesn't know how to calculate the result of that formula. I'm also going to multiply it by 100 so it becomes a percentage. There it is. If I click on this one, I can go in here and I can change it to a percentage, 0 decimal places, put a percentage at the end. Okay, so this has now become efficiency percentage. Go load into project, overwrite, and there you go. So I have a percentage efficiency of, what's that? 1,369%. That's totally unacceptable. I'm going to have to change that. So there you go. So of course, because that's reporting a parameter that's live, as I change the size of the room, that actually updates because it's calculating based on the area, which is updating dynamically. All right, moving on really, really quickly. I realize I'm actually running a little bit late on time here. Piece of casework, make an extrusion, create a fillet. You can see here I've now got these tangential locks. Revit now creates that relationship and locks that. I have played around with this a little bit, and in terms of making this parametric, I'm not quite sure. I think you might have to put a conditional statement in there that stops it from going beyond a certain angle, because you can see that it will break, maybe not. And so that's a tool I think that everybody in the Revit community will probably have a bit of a think about and digest, and then come back and actually start to report some applications for it, perhaps. Or maybe everybody's just really smart and I'm really dumb. Okay, so planting schedule. I've got a really nice planting schedule here, and I've gone through and I've added in some sorting and added in some grand totals. It's going to be a bit of a mess, but there you go. Then what I can do in Revit is go create view template, and I'll call that planting schedule template. And then it asks me the usual questions: which part of the view properties do I want to grab in this template? So then what I do is, I'll just go back to another view here. I'm going to create a new schedule. It has to be the same category, just be aware of that. Or at least in my bit of playing around with it, that's what I find. So planting, I'm going to have to put at least one field in there, so it actually lets me finish this. So fingers crossed, if I go apply view apply view template properties, there you go, look at that, it actually worked. So that's now applied that those properties. So I'll just move on because I'm getting a little bit short on time. I guess I was probably talking a bit slow maybe. Very quickly, structural. I won't have time to go over this in great detail, but if I look at this column here, for example, I can now put a vertical split in there. If you're using structural detailing, or sorry, not structural detailing, sorry, advanced steel, we can now go into the structure thing here, and we can go connection, and we can add in a real connection. There is a basic library of connectors that are now being shipped with 2017. There's this plate here, for example, that I can add in. There's another example of it there. That's really not where you would place it because it's meant to be a base plate, so that was a bit naughty. Please forgive me. This is some rebar. I had a bit of a play with that in terms of placing it, so it does look to be quite an intuitive type of package. Probably be doing a disservice if I were to try to go any further in explaining structural stuff, given my lack of knowledge of it. Okay, so very quickly, we've got this generic Revit ducting that is just this is like a magic trick. Look at this. So here I've got some standard Revit ducting. I'll grab it now because I'm using, or I've got fabrication installed. I do have access to all of the database here, and I can place these objects in. But what I can also do is grab the generic duct or generic pipe or whatever, and then go assign to fabrication, pick the appropriate service. So we'll say general return, and then we now actually have real parts, as they're called, not Revit families, Revit parts. And we can start to add in information into these. So that's quite a neat little thing. Again, moving on, we've now got the ability to add in slopes. We also have the ability to use automatic routing. Let's just see if I can get this to work here. Click on there and click on there, and then go through a number of different permutations of solutions. It does work on offsets vertically and so forth as well. So that's quite neat, and I'll just drag this over on top like so. That's better. Okay, so let's just try and show everybody how this works. So if I go in here and go to hangers, pick that one as the correct one. Okay, you notice that the duct in this case is populating. Sorry, is the host, I should say. So what's happening there is I've got my hanger that's sitting on the, or hosting itself to the duct, I should say. But also note that it's automatically picking up the structural slab. Didn't like that one because I moved it away. But as I move the structural slab around, which I'm not doing a very good job of, then you'll note that the hanger is resizing itself. Also, what you can do, as I said, you can have these sort of set over, so you could run some piping along there, for example. And if I were to make a copy of that particular hanger directly underneath that one, I'll just see if, there we go, it actually worked for me. Look at that. So this is this idea of having stacked hangers as well. So I think if you're in that space, this is definitely going to be something of interest to you. So those are some nice little refinements. All right, well, I think that covers everything there. I had to speed things up a little bit at the end. My apologies. So I would like to now throw out to everybody who's listening, if they've got any questions. If, the next few minutes, we'll see if anybody has got anything specifically about the presentation that they'd like to ask. Hopefully, not a question I can't answer. Okay, here we go. Chris has asked, can we get a copy of the PowerPoint you used? It certainly can. Certainly can. Okay, absolutely, Chris. I'll make a note of that. I'll also be uploading this onto, I have been recording it, and I'll be uploading that onto YouTube so you can get to listen to my croaky voice again, if that's what you really desire. I guess if you're suffering from insomnia and you're having problems getting off to sleep, might be worthwhile looking it up on YouTube. Okay, what else have we got here? Let me see if I'm just trying to get the questions to expand. Just bear with me for a second here. Oh yeah, so I've just had somebody else, Emma. Yes, Emma, you've same question about PowerPoints. So I'll do it as a PDF and send that out to everybody. All right, well, can't see any questions streaming in, which is interesting. I don't know what that means. That could mean either that I've answered every single question that anybody has, or everybody's fallen asleep at their desks. Okay. Will there be further webinars, e.g. for the structural part? Okay, not planned at this stage, actually. So no, not planned at this stage. What else have we got here? I read that the view that uses depth. I don't know why this is so hard for me to read. It just seems to be not allowing me to maximize the screen. Let me just scroll through here. I read that a view that uses depth queuing can only be exported to PDF using raster setting. Is that true? And if so, does Revit XT add-in have both options? Interesting. Okay, I haven't actually tested that. I would assume that it will use raster setting, and that's simply because if you think about it, the way that Revit's displaying the graphics is it's in a shaded view. If I change that to vector, then effectively, I guess all of that shading information would go. That would be my thinking. It's really just going to become pretty much just the black and white portion. So yeah, that's an interesting thought. And Revit XT, well, Revit XT would be exportable using vector for sure, because it's affecting the line weight. But the two together, I think you are going to have to use raster, because you won't be able to get that shading information otherwise. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate that. You know, it's a big impulse to take out time from your day. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending. And actually, I can see a question here. How does any of this relate to Revit LT? Well, the core functionality in Revit there will relate. The parts relating to the structural and the fabrication and so forth, the MEP parts won't, because of course those tools aren't incorporated in Revit LT. And there is a limited sort of set of add-ons that you can add into Revit LT. Effectively, it's only, you know, the subscription benefit official Revit add-ons that you can add into Revit LT. All right, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'll finish up now, but I appreciate everybody's time, and have a good day.